Page 377 is where we're looking at our review for topic 6. So to start out with here, if we look at the vocabulary, number 1, a ratio of a quantity to 100 is and that would be a percent. Cent has to do with 100. A blank compares two numbers or the number of items in two groups. So comparing things, that would be a ratio. Number 3, blank are numbers that are easier to compute mentally, and that is compatible numbers. We talked about that when we did estimating percents. We found numbers that worked better together depending if you did the fraction method or not. This next part, they're doing matching. And so if you want to go through the matching for this, if you want to just pause this for a second, and then I'm going to go ahead and just draw the lines and you can see if yours match up with what I've got here. So here we go. Okay, that should be the way the lines are drawn, and if you have a question about that, you can ask me, but we'll be going through some other problems to get practice on all of those as we go through the rest of our review here. So in lesson 1, we talked about percents, understanding percents. And so this part, they just want us to write the percent of each figure that is shaded. And so this first one, there's 100 squares altogether. We've got 10 by 10, 10 times 10 is 100. And so if we count that up, there's a total of 21 out of 100 that are shaded. And so that means 21%, because a percent's a number out of 100. Number 2, we definitely do not have 100 squares or rectangles, as the case would be here, I guess. Okay, so there are 10 total rectangles. 7 out of the 10 are shaded in. We're trying to find out how many out of 100. So we need to multiply both of those by 10. So that's 70 out of 100. So that would be 70% that are shaded. The next part, they want us to write the ratios as percents. So 14 losses in 50 games. That's 14 out of 50. A percent we know is a number out of 100. So how do we get from 50 to 100? Multiply by 2. That'd be 28 out of 100, which means 28%. Number 4, 4/5 of the students ride a bus. So 4 out of 5. We're trying to find how many out of 100. So that way we need to multiply by 20. If you're not sure what to multiply by here, if you do 100 divided by 5, that'll tell you what you need to multiply by. So 4 times 20 is 80. That's 80 out of 100, which means 80%. Number 5, segment AB represents 25%. What is the length of the line segment? That is 100%. Okay, so 5 feet is 25%. So if we try and get to 100%, how do we do that? That would be multiplying by 4. So 5 times 4, that would be 20 feet. I didn't really mention this yet, but hopefully you guys can figure out as you're going through these that it would be a good idea to pause and try and work these out first before you watch the answers, and that way you're getting some practice and not just watching me work these out. You get a lot it's a lot more helpful for you to try and actually think about these and work them out yourself, besides just watching me work them out. Lesson 2, we were looking at fractions, decimals, and percents. So they're giving us one form and we're trying to write it in another form. So on number 1, they're giving us a decimal and they want a fraction and a percent. So this decimal, if we read this, besides saying 0.16, we could read this as 16 hundredths. So 16 hundredths. Always with fractions, we're going to try and reduce if we can. If nothing else, you can see maybe they're both even numbers, so you can divide by 2. These are actually both divisible by 4, and so that'd be 4/25ths, and we can't reduce that any further. If you'll notice here, before we reduced, that was 16 hundredths, and we know percent is a number out of 100, so that would be 16%. Number 2, they've given us a fraction, so one thing we need is the percent. So 63 out of 100, that'd be 63%. And then the fraction is 63 hundredths, so our decimal would be 63 hundredths. Number 3, they've given us the percent, so fraction would be 27 out of 100, which we can't reduce, and the decimal would be 27 hundredths. Number 4, we've got a fraction again, like number 2, but I'm going to look at this problem because this one's a little bit different. We've got 7/8. So what we've had so far, our denominator, if it's 10 or 100 or 1,000, we can just go ahead and change that right over to a decimal. Or if the denominator, we can get it to 100, we can say that's our percent. 8 doesn't work real good to get to like 100 or something like that. So what we can do in a case like this is we can divide this out. So 7/8. I'm going to divide this out. Remember, numerator goes on the inside. So 8 doesn't go into 7. 8 goes into 70. 8 times is 64. If you subtract is 6, bring down to 0. 8 goes into 60 7 times, which is 56. 4 left. We need to add another 0 and bring it down, and then 8 goes into 45 times evenly. So that would be 875 thousandths as the decimal. And then as a fraction, oh, we already have the fraction, sorry. As a percent, you could think about it this way. I guess we'll go to the fraction first of all. 875 thousandths we could write as a fraction, 875 thousandths. And then to try and get this to 100, we actually need to divide. So if you do 100, 1,000 divided by 10 would get you to 100. And again, if you're not sure how to do that, if you take 1,000 divided by 100, you'll get 10. It's those fact families with multiplication and division. And then 875 divided by 10 is 87.5. So that's 87.5 out of 100. And so that means 87.5%. Okay, so sometimes the numbers might not work out as nicely, and in those cases we need to be able to divide it out in order to figure out the other parts. Just to mention here, I'm not going to work out these next ones. If you have questions on it, you can let me know. But number 5, would be 55%, and then the fraction 55 hundredths reduces to 11/20ths. And number 6, we've got 7%, so that would be 7 out of 100, and the decimal would be 7 hundredths. And then the last question they want us to write 8% as a decimal and as a fraction. So as a decimal, well, as a fraction, 8% would be 8/100ths, which would be our clue for the decimal. It's going to be 8/100ths. Remember, we also talked about to change from a percent to a decimal, you can move your decimal 2 places to the left. And then this fraction we can reduce down to 2/25. Or if you want to reduce by 2 first, it'd be 4/50, and then you can reduce to 2/25. Lesson 3, we talked about big and small percents, and this is where especially we talked about just changing between percents and decimals. Getting the decimals first might make things easier on you. So on this one, if you move the decimal 2 spots to the left, that'd be 1 40/100ths, or if you don't need the 0 at the end, you could just say 1 4/10ths. And then that's our decimal. Then the fraction, we could say, would be 1 4/10ths, and we can reduce that to 1 2/5ths. Number 2, we have 0.7%. I'm just going to rewrite that with the decimal point instead of a fraction. And then if you move the decimal 2 spots to the left and add a 0, that would be the same as 7/1000ths for our decimal. And then that means our fraction would be 7/1000. Number 3, decimal 2 spots to the left would be 3 75/100ths. So 3 75/100ths. Those you can both reduce by 25, and that would be 3 3/4. Number 4 is a percent. Move it 2 spots to the left. It would be 33 10,000ths, and the fraction would be 33 10,000ths. And that can't be reduced. Number 5, same thing. Decimal is 5,000ths. And if you reduce both of those by 5, that's 1/200. Number 6, you could just say is 2 5/10ths. If you want to put a 0 after it, you can. And then we can reduce that to 2.5. And number 7, 945%. As a decimal is 9 45/100ths. And then a fraction is 9 9/20ths. Section 4, estimating to find percents. This is where we rounded off and tried to make the problems easier to work out. So if you look at number 1, 22% of 96, we're just going to make the numbers easier to work with. So you can just say maybe 20% of 100. Of means multiply, so 20 over 100 times 100 over 1 if you want. Both of these can be reduced by 100 since we're multiplying fractions, and that would be the same as 20. Or you could change 20% to a decimal and work it out that way. Other options here, you could have done 25% of 100, which would have been 25, and you could also have done 20% of 95, which would be 19. If you're estimating, you shouldn't have decimals in your answers because we're trying to make the numbers nicer to work with. Number 2, 38% is pretty close to 40%, and 58 is close to 60. So this one, I'll just show you a different way. We talked about was doing a proportion. We have 40 out of 100. We're trying to find the number out of 60. 100 to 60 doesn't seem to work real nice, but if you divide both of those by 10, that would be 4/10. And you can multiply both of those by 6, and then that would be 24. So we're saying 38% of 58 is pretty close to 24. So it's less than half of a number that's a little less than 60. So half of 60 is 30. So this is a little less than half of the number that's a little less than that. Anyway, seems like a reasonable answer for that one. Okay, number 3. 9% of 89, so we could say that's about 10% of 90. Just to show our other option we talked about, you could change the percent to a decimal and multiply. And again, I don't mean to confuse anybody by showing you the different things here. I'm just trying to show you do have options, and whatever option you want to use to work these out is fine. So 10% of 90 is 9. And we've talked about that one before. 10% of a number, you just move the decimal one spot to the left. Number 4, 76%. You could say it's close to 75%. And then 41 is close to 40. 75%, just to show another different way here, if you reduce that down to 3/4. We did a fraction earlier, but we didn't really have to reduce it. With this one, it's actually to our advantage to reduce, because with 140, those didn't reduce quite as nice as 4 and 40 do. And so we work that out, and that would be 30. Another way you could have done that, you could have done 80% of 40, and that would have been 32. Number 5, that's pretty close to 50% of 70, and that's half of 70, basically. And if you go and divide that out, you should get 35. Number 6, you could round that to 25% of 60. So that's like 1/4 of 60. And you can reduce ahead of time on those if you want, but if you want to just multiply and then divide it out, you can. That would be 15. Another option you could do for this, you could do 30% of 60. So let's just do that as a decimal just to show you another way. Move your decimal over one spot, that would be 18. So both pretty close together, so those are both pretty good estimates for that one. And number 7, Joanna wants to buy a backpack. It costs $37.98, but there's tax. Estimate the amount of sales tax Joanna will pay. So it's not saying how much she's going to pay overall, just what the tax would be. So the tax would be 8.75% of $37.98. We're just going to round these off, make them a little nicer. So let's say that's about 10%. Let's say that's about $40. Again, 10% of something, you could just move your decimal over one spot. I'm going to reduce this. And if you watched the video the other day, you might have remembered that 10% is 1/10 as a decimal. So that's 4 out of 40, and what that means is $4 would be the sales tax there. Another thing you could do is if you did 9% instead of 10%. If you did, let's say, 9% of $40, and then that should come out as $3.60. Section 5 was finding the part or the percent, and this is the one we split up into two different sections. Number 1, they're just wanting us to find 9% of 124. So the percent we can change to a decimal, move it 2 spots to the left. Of means multiply. So if you multiply that out, and you should get 11 1600ths. And for sure, to make it quicker for working this stuff out, you can use your calculators, is okay. Number 2, what percent of 20 is 3? So this one, I'm going to translate to an equation. So what percent, that's what we're trying to find. So we can say x or x percent, or if you just want to do p for percent. Of means times, 20 is means equals 3. And then we're just going to solve. So they are multiplying next to our variable, means we need to divide. We always do the opposite operation. And when we divide, we should get 1500ths. Now what we have to remember is that is our percent as a decimal. So we still have to move the decimal 2 spots to the right. And then also we need to put the percent on the end of that. So 15%. So we're saying 15% of 20 is 3. Number 3, we're back to one like number 1. So we're just going to change the percent to a decimal. Of means multiply. And that would be 8 4/10. Number 4, back to an equation. So what percent? I'll just do p for percent this time. Of means times 110. Is means equals 71.5. And then they're multiplying, so we need to divide on both sides to get those to cancel. And when you divide that out, you get 6500ths, and that means 65%. So we're saying 65% of 110 is 71.5. Looks like that's pretty reasonable. It's over half, so over 50% should be good. Number 5, we can just change the percent to a decimal and multiply, and that would be 35 2600ths. Number 6, back to an equation. So what percent? I'll just do p for percent again. Of means times. 30 is means equals 24. Not sure what happened to that 2 there, but anyway. They're multiplying, so we need to divide by 30. When you divide that out, you should get 8/10. Move your decimal over, add the 0, that means 80%. So 80% of 30 is 24. And number 7, on Tuesday, 620 students attended a middle school. A survey showed 341 students brought lunch to school. So the question is, what percent of the students brought their lunches? So different ways we could do this. One way is we could say it's 341 out of 620. And you could just divide that out and get a decimal, and then you could change that over to a percent. So 55%. Another way you could do this is if you look at the question that I underlined in red, we can make that into an equation. What percent of the students, so of the 620, brought their lunches? So what percent of 620 is the 341? And then to solve, you divide by 620, and then notice you're at the same spot that we were over here. Okay, 55%, a little over half brought their lunches that day. Lesson 6 was finding the whole. So this is where different ways of doing it, but I like to work with the percent equation again with these. So 140%, we're going to change that to a decimal. You don't need the 0 at the end, but if you put it there, it doesn't hurt anything. Of, so times what number, that's what we're trying to find, whatever variable you want to use. Is means equals 308. So again, they are multiplying. To get rid of that, we need to divide on both sides. And when you do that, you should get 220. So 140% of 220 is 308. Number 2, same idea, so 62%. We're going to change to a decimal. Of, so times what number is, so equals 186. They're multiplying, let's divide. And that should be 300. Okay, and just like anything, I mean, repetition, the more practice you get with this, you get to a point where you're not really even going to have to think about it too much, what you're doing, probably. So percent to a decimal times what number equals 120. So divide. And that would be 150. Again, you might think, well, I'm dividing, shouldn't the number get smaller? Not in this case, because we divided by a number less than 1. So we're saying 80% of 150 is 120. That seems pretty reasonable. Number 4, 40% to a decimal times what number is 10? Let's divide it. And that would be 25. 40% of 25 is 10. And number 5, Desmond paid 8.5% sales tax when he bought a new phone. The sales tax was $12.75. What was the total cost of the phone, including tax? Okay, so basically what we've got here, 8.5% of the phone cost was $12.75. So 8.5% as a decimal times whatever our phone cost was is past tense of is, $12.75. They're multiplying, so let's divide. And when you work that out, that would be $150. That's not our final answer yet. That is just going to be the cost of the phone. So our next step, $150 plus $12.75 for the tax. would be $162.75. So this gives you an idea of what we're looking at in topic 6. Again, highly recommend doing some practice problems on the Pearson Realize website to get some more practice on this and some feedback. And if you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day.